You will find a detailed review and analysis of about 60 candidates in my comprehensive, No Stone Left Unturned investigation, Satoshi Nakamoto and the Origins of Bitcoin. The book is available in various electronic and print formats on Amazon and Shopify under the displayed links.
So welcome to another Fireside chat this time with Bjørn Bjercke. And just to let you know, I learned about Bjørn in a TV production on the blockchain OneCoin, or what they call a blockchain. And it's a pleasure now that Bjørn, who is a blockchain and Bitcoin expert, was willing to chat with me here on his first coin and blockchain experience, and then maybe go on a tangent a little bit on the OneCoin story that he has. Okay, welcome Bjørn, and may I ask you to introduce yourself a little bit for a general audience?
Yeah, thank you, Jens, and thank you for letting me come on your podcast. Yeah, as you said, my name is Bjørn Kienholz Bjercke, and I've been in Bitcoin since. It's hard because I saw Bitcoin early 2012, and I was very skeptical. I checked it out. I read the white paper. And my conclusion at the time is this isn't going to happen. This is some scam, or I was extremely skeptical. And I put it aside without buying any Bitcoins or looking deeper into it until I had my parental leave. I had a child during 2012, and I had a parental leave summer of 2013. And I remember Googling it and looking for it because I was curious to see, has this disappeared or where is it at? And I was very kind of shocked to see that it had survived, and not only survived, but it had thrived and was approaching. It had gone up a lot in price, and it was approaching $1,000. This made me ponder because there was one aspect that I had been working on for the longest time, which was basically financial networks. I'd worked with banks and stock brokerage houses on proprietary cabling to the stock exchanges from the stock brokerage house, and also banks and banking system, the SWIFT system that we all know today. Everything from configuring and setting up the necessary cabling and understanding routering and so on and so forth. Now, from my experience up until 2013 or summer 2013 was that all these proprietary cabling and financial networks were really expensive compared to internet infrastructure. So these were completely separate networks that weren't interconnected with the internet in any way. And it was very intriguing and profound to me that Bitcoin was running on the internet. So here you had a financial product that was running on publicly used infrastructure, which means the costs are way low. And I decided basically there and then that, okay, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to start my own company and see what are the faults in the system, because there's bound to be some faults on Bitcoin. So I basically started my own company. It's called IT, and I did a lot of Google licensing and just smaller stuff. So I would have an income, and every single moment I had free, I would read more up on Bitcoin. And I basically was skeptical and waiting for when am I going to find that hole in the system? Where am I? Is it the wallet? Is it the software? Is it the mining? Where is that hole that the hackers can destroy the system? And sometime during 2014, I'm not exactly sure, but I was just amazed and pretty satisfied in accepting that Bitcoin is probably, or as good as it gets. It's basically unhackable because of the decentralized nature of Bitcoin. There is no way you can hack a block, but you got to hack every single node and you have 10 minutes to do it. So during the fall of 2014, I basically just pivoted my business towards how can I do something with this? I started mining. I started looking into running a larger mining operation, and I was running nodes. I think nodes are very underestimated in Bitcoin because you would think that Blockstream today has some kind of control over the software and where Bitcoin is going. But in fact, they don't, because it's a democratic system and running a node is your vote. I know that most Bitcoiners have heard of this term, like not your keys, not your coins, and not your coin or your keys, your Bitcoin, which is about keeping your Bitcoins off exchanges. But running nodes is equally as important because it's you decide which node you want to run, which software you want to run. So not your node, not your rules. Your node, you decide the rules of Bitcoin. And this is much more powerful than I think most people have understood so far. And if you can run a node, you don't decide where Bitcoin is going. And it doesn't matter how many Bitcoin you have. I know that a lot of people out there are scared, or a lot of Bitcoiners are scared that BlackRock and MicroStrategy will somehow, some way start running this network. And it simply isn't going to happen because of the decentral nature and the democratic voting system through the nodes. Someone that doesn't own a single Bitcoin, not even a single Satoshi, can have more power over the network than BlackRock and MicroStrategy, and they're called Strategy now. So that for me is super interesting because I don't think in human history that we've ever had a system whereas the ones that own the most of that system or owns the most of the value in that system does not have the control over that system. And yeah, that was my getting into Bitcoin and understanding those facts, basically.
Yeah. Were there actually ever any, I mean, as you are the expert, I'm asking you, like, what about these things like Ripple? These things, would they not be more commensurate with these professional banking and these needs? Or where do you see like Bitcoin's special role?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up that point because Ripple was very early on 100% controlled by one company, or XRP token by Ripple. And even though they share their information and you can run a Ripple node or you can take part in their kind of blockchain structure, you don't get to commit changes or have any influence over how rules are being changed. It is definitely has a centralized component to it, and that gives you more flexibility, but it also has the potential to be shut down. Basically, Ripple can be shut down. And there's a great example out there that we've seen recently, which is Solana. Solana has been down, I think, 11 times or something so far. And
But that was for
we're,
technical reasons, right? Not for regulatory reasons, or?
yeah, that was for technical reasons for sure, but it's definitely a telltale sign that it's completely centralized, that there is somewhere where you can shut down the system. And I'm sure if there was regulatory push to shut down, Solana would be gone in a matter of minutes. This cannot happen to Bitcoin. It is simply impossible because of the decentralized democratic way it's set up. And then you have the influence. Look at Ethereum, for instance. Ethereum is, for the most part, decentralized. It's democratic. But you do have Vitalik Buterin, who has a major influence on the system. The same goes for Cardano, which has its ADA coin. And there you have Charles Hopkins. And it seems to me like if Vitalik says jump, the network just says how high. No one asks questions or is critical to their voices. And this is a major problem. This is why Satoshi's greatest achievement was disappearing. His second greatest achievement was building Bitcoin, because he knew that this influence factor, the centralized influence factor, is a major component to how a network like this can work. I don't think there'll ever be something like Bitcoin ever again. Bitcoin is different. It's special. It's a major black swan event. And the invention itself is so underestimated. It's incredibly underestimated, as in, I believe Bitcoin to be the second greatest invention after the internet in the last 100 years. And I do think that future generations will even say that Bitcoin is the greater invention over the internet.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. As I've written a book and published a couple of videos, and some are actually just in the make that I think will reveal a lot of things. But yeah, I completely share this impression that Bitcoin is very special. All the Bitcoiners evidently agree. And it's like a historic thing, right? Like how I got into Bitcoin earlier, but then what made me write my book and doing all the research is really this historical element, right? It's if you I think I went on ChatGPT at the time, right? Because I just wanted to validate. I'm not a complete believer in ChatGPT. There's also some crap generated, but if you ask a question about a topic you don't know anything about, you get a lot of keywords you can validate elsewhere, right? And I was stunned that I didn't prime the ChatGPT on Bitcoin, right? So it was a fresh, essentially, chat. And I asked, what is the greatest mystery of science and technology, right? And ChatGPT came up with the creator of Bitcoin, essentially, right? Who is the creator of Bitcoin? Because we don't have a single invention of any impact. We have these archaic things like who invented the wheel, right? There wasn't a patent office at the time, and people were just more pragmatic rather than having a historic angle. But let's say any modern, when we have writings or something like that, we have Galileo Galilei who put down all these kind of drafts and so on, but he didn't try to occlude his identity. And then we have, let's say, these things where whatever there was religious prosecution. So Charles Darwin and Copernicus and a couple of them, they at least delayed significantly the release of their stuff because they were afraid that they would be ousted or even punished or killed by prosecution. So there was a human point in not coming out. But in Bitcoin, it's really like the first thing. And I'm a scientist myself, that's my education, right? And you wouldn't have any case, like usually people are fighting for having a claim on being the inventor, right? That with the Nobel Prizes, for example, right? There's often arguments why these two chaps got it and not the third one and the fourth one. And that is such an accomplishment. I would just like to know from your side, I was always wondering, was Satoshi doing this for protecting his privacy, or maybe both, right? Or for keep creating an origin myth, right? And avoiding this regulatory element that could shut down and has shut down actually many similar projects in the 1990s and 2000s, right? So what's your angle on that?
I've studied, I would call it the word of Satoshi, or whatever Satoshi has written throughout that we've found in emails and chat rooms and so on. And it seems to me that he was an extremely humble person, because he did not expect Bitcoin to go where it has gone. I think the reason why he chose to use a pseudonym, Satoshi Nakamoto, and not his real name, presumably, we don't know that for a fact, but we can't find anyone called Satoshi Nakamoto, so there we go. But I don't think it was self-protection at all. It may have been self-protection. As you said, other projects have been shut down, and there was a push. You had the Silver Dollar project or several other projects in the 80s and 90s to make a separate currency outside the US dollar in the States, and they all went to jail for counterfeit. There was really a need to do this in a way that you wouldn't
Yeah,
expose yourself.
but you would have like the guys who founded, let's say, Ethereum, you mentioned one, and Cardano, and essentially as there's one or the other where we don't know who founded them, but they never got that much impact in the public, right? But most of them are out, and Ethereum is not being shut down and so on. And even though
Yeah.
there was pre-mining and all that, so let's say, just to provoke, to tease you a little bit on that, Satoshi could still come out and say, oh yeah, actually Vitalik didn't get whatever, like arrested, and Ethereum didn't get shut down. So I now can come out, and because it's all fine, right? And he's still not doing that. So there seems to be a bigger story, or an amazingly unique, as you said, humble character who
Yeah.
doesn't exploit neither his fame, his potential impact, nor his fortunes to, like, he resists all that. And we are talking about, like, most of us talk about him like he has been a long time dead, or that might be the reason. But I don't, everybody can die, but he's probably about in his 50s or something like that right now. So most likely he is still alive, right? Most people at this age still alive. And it seems like the whole setup, when people tell me like, oh, where he vanished because he died or something, and we all know these characters who actually died at a certain stage there, but the whole, I think he choreographed this persona Satoshi Nakamoto right from the outset, because he didn't seem to have talked to anybody at the time. And I talked to a lot of people, either confidentially or even on my chats, who were around at the time. And it's quite unlikely that somebody who would have had this ingenious idea wouldn't at least share an inkling of that with others. They were all friends or meeting, having crazy parties and so on. So if you were in that community, somebody would have you, it would be hard for yourself to keep your mouth extremely shut, to especially if you didn't have the vision of how big Bitcoin would become.
But
There were a lot of
are you taking into account what we know today is so much different compared to what Satoshi knew back in 2008, 2009?
he did these calculations, right? You read his messages, and I just browsed through to a lot of them again for my next video. And he did have these calculations, like these back of the envelope calculations, when he said, okay, there's so much money in the world, whatever, this M2 amount. And he juggled a little bit around with that. And then he extrapolated whatever, if a certain fraction of that was to go into Bitcoin, it's not so easy to get into mind-boggling figures, right? Astonishing thing is that he was never really, at least not as Satoshi. Privately, he might be a different figure, and he might have created just somebody, okay, now I'm Satoshi Nakamoto when I'm posting, and really like doing a psychological step, right, to protect his identity. So I don't think the person that we read the messages from was exactly the character that he is as a real person, and that he extrapolated it. The astonishing thing is he never bragged about the tremendous wealth he would be getting or the others. Oh yeah, we're all going to buy a big yacht in the whatever Mediterranean and go on cruises and waste all the money, all that. He never said that.
No.
And
But
so
do you think that one thing is dreaming about taking percentages of the M2 money supply. The other thing is that realistic at the time he did it, right? Because you also see stuff like you should buy some just in case it takes off,
yeah,
or
yeah.
this is an experiment. this is a social experiment, it might not work. He was very honest about that this might not work, but if it does, you should get some just in case.
Yeah, that's what he literally said, right?
Yeah.
But
So, and that is extremely profound when you look at something that happened closer to 2020 or 2021. People were launching coins expecting to make billions of dollars. And this is even in 2014 when OneCoin was starting, they saw that this is a major opportunity to do a play and make millions. I don't think Satoshi had that mindset. I don't think he said to himself that I'm going to make millions off of this. I don't think money was, or I should say, wealth was one of his goals. I think
yeah.
money, changing money was one of his goals for sure, but not wealth creation for himself.
Yeah,
That
I think,
wasn't.
yeah. I talked to a couple of guys who were around at the time, and I also got some hints from them. And actually, my favorite candidate came from one of these guys who told me, like, there's one guy we completely overlooked. But anyway, yeah, if you look at like the unicorns, right, like Amazon and Google and so on, these guys, I think, were initially not primarily driven by money. And the more you get to the peer-to-peer kind of cypherpunk scene and so on, I talked to some people from that scene. And while a lot of them have some money nowadays, that wasn't the primary driver. They had some more idealistic or even anarchic fantasies or something like that. And some of them spent the money as quickly as they made it, sometimes even on just altruistic reasons, not necessarily on business. There's a whole bandwidth of people. Some were very wealth oriented and some were not caring at all. But on the other hand, if you look at it, I just asked some of them, and maybe you also have a good grasp of that. Like if you imagine a person with a skill set in 2008 of Satoshi Nakamoto, right? Being able to pull so many strings together on an objective, in this case, a financial, or if it was like an internet technology or something like that. I don't think he was a poor guy. Right? If you had this guy applying for a position at Google or any of the big shots who pay huge salaries, right? I don't think we are talking about a guy who would not know that he would accumulate a few millions in his lifetime, right? If you have some Silicon Valley salaries or so. So that guy wasn't really like looking into, oh yeah, I'm going to be poor, right? Maybe he wasn't looking into, I'm going to be a multi or even a whatever. He has now about 100 billion, if you consider that he would own about 1 million coin, which is quite credible to assume. But he's still, this guy probably, for example, the guy I think who is Satoshi, he founded a couple of companies afterwards, right? On a scale of like investments of a few 100 million from VC and so on. So these guys are not poor. And usually they scale them up and make them to a multi-billion-dollar company. Usually, otherwise, if that perspective wasn't there, you wouldn't get a VC in terms of a few 100 million, right? So it's not about poor, right? Like this guy can probably go and buy a nice house for himself in a place he wants and a nice holiday home and doesn't really struggle at the lower end of the financial income scale, right? So
No,
a
but
lot of
don't
the
you think that, because it seems to me that he started life as poor and he's self-made. So he has had the struggles of understanding, because how else would you be able to piece together a more fair system? If you're born into money, you're all about wealth preserving. And I don't think a wealth preserving person would be able to come up with this.
yeah,
It
you
needs
need
to
to
be
have
someone that has struggled with the system to understand that the prelude of what how money works.
yeah, I think we all don't know, but I think what you say is plausible, right? But there's also other pathways, right? I looked into, for
Mm.
example, spy stories, right? There were these guys in the Cambridge Five, for example, right? Kim Philby, I think, is the most prominent name of them. They were all coming from, let's say, upper class families and then decided to spy for the Soviet Secret Service while in the MI6, right? I think that was in the 1950s or something like that, right? So they did that out of I think eventually they understood that it was a false idealization of the Soviet communist system and what it really did to the people. But yeah, like being, let's say, somewhat a little bit more on the opposing subversive side in the financial system, it would be plausible either you were disadvantaged in that system and saw with your intelligence what was wrong, or you were just intellectually interested, right? Like that, and or fascinated by these cypherpunks or so. Yeah, but I don't think he was affluent, right? Born with a golden spoon in his mouth and so on, and in a billionaire kind of community and so on. I would say that's unlikely, but he was extremely good at keeping private, but resisting a lot of temptations, right? I talked to a guy who was he wasn't a spy, but an employee on the CIA, right? And like he told me, and it's even public, it's not a big secret, you get a very extensive training to enact essentially somebody else. You get trained a lot of methods, and then usually when they deploy a person in another country to pretend to be somebody else or to enact a certain figure with a credible story, right? Is usually takes a lot of training and support, right? So you're not left usually on your own devices. So these kind of spy stories, and of course I don't say Satoshi was a spy, but there's a lot of parallels on what you have to do to be consistent over a long period of time to enact somebody. But then of course you have this unique thing that you do this on the internet, right? Which takes away a lot of you don't have to, you're not 24/7 online, right? You're not 24/7 observable. Nobody can centrally somebody watching your door and seeing whether you have kids and family and girlfriends and so on. So he exploited that a little bit. But I also, I think,
but at the same time, it's hard to talk about because I feel there's a bunch of us that started in Bitcoin early that has a different mindset. Like I've already explained my mindset, which was basically how to run proprietary financial networks in a much, much cheaper fashion using the internet, leveraging the internet. That was my revolutionary thought about Bitcoin, why I got into Bitcoin. It had nothing to do with wealth creation. And I've followed this study and I've actually met Andreas Angelopoulos several times and I've had chats with him. And he was in cybersecurity and had a great understanding of networks. And he saw the network potential and all other factors. If you scale away or if you peel off wealth creation to Bitcoin, what are you left with? You're left with a whole lot of great ways of thinking and a great kind of machinery of security, networking, and all these other factors. And I'm thinking to myself that Satoshi, he might have known a bunch of these stuff and wanted to integrate that, but I'm not 100% sold on the idea that Satoshi knew actually how great Bitcoin is solving these problems. Now, what are we, 16 years in? How well Bitcoin is performing, as in not the financials, but the security aspect, the everything that Bitcoin has of kind of functionality and fighting off. I mean, he basically built a software that has an immune system. It gets attacked. It gets attacked more than any other bank in the world. If we compare it to banks, it's probably the most hacked or most looked at code of anything out there. And no one can penetrate it. No one can do anything about it. And that for me is the main genius. Not that it's worth $100,000 or whatever the worth is today. That's a crazy side effect to all of this.
If you look at his language, and again, we have to be careful because he enacted somebody, right? But it's difficult to suppress all your things. And if you look at the spectrum of his expertise, I don't think he wasn't like into financial markets. I don't think he was coming from the financial end, right? I don't think he was a hardcore cypherpunk. He knew about them. I think he had contacts with them, but he wasn't any crypto anarchic or extreme guy. He was more like a pragmatic guy who just wanted to make this thing happen. And when you said like attacking, right? The word attacking is in one form or the other, even in the abstract of the white paper, I think twice even. So he was definitely aware that this thing will get attacked. And that is one of the major success factors, which is quite evident. The other big thing that's pretty much the paradigm of the whole Bitcoin community is that limited supply. This famous 21 million, right? I think that was very important to him because he could have easily, mathematically, it would have been easy to find a different function of distribution that would essentially never really peter out, maybe reduce, or he could have done a constant rate to have essentially a number sequence essentially that converges towards a finite value wasn't necessary. And you could argue whether even practically Bitcoin would have probably technically could have also survived without a 21 million thing. If you just had a very slow inflation rate, and mathematically that could have been done very easily. But that was
why 21?
Yeah, exactly. I did a lot of research on that. And the thing is, he seems to have probably implanted a couple of messages that were so hidden that we don't get them, or at least we don't get a straight answer. It almost seems like he wanted us to do exactly what we're doing now, this speculation. And if you look into like the history of religion or so, right? Like pretty much any people in the world have a more or less sophisticated religious belief that is a major part of tribe formation or social structures, because people just have to believe certain things, and that's a very strong driver. Even nowadays, look at Iran and Israel. It's about these beliefs that you cannot scientifically prove. And so it seems to me like that would be, I always wonder, sometimes I wish I could talk to Satoshi. He shouldn't tell me at all who he is, and he should use any cryptography and internet technology, privacy enhancing technology to protect himself. And I would ask him not to tell me his name. But these questions I want to ask him. Why 21? Actually, the natural number would have been 42, right? Because like you would say, the initial Coinbase transaction, why do you take 50? Usually you would take a power of 10 or some binary thing, right? The binary would actually have been, in terms of computer, more logical, right? We have these megabytes and so on. So that was one thing. And then he just said at some stage, oh, initially I picked 42 million as total supply, but that was too big, so I took 21. And that's not really any logic in it. It's random, right? If you talked about orders of magnitude, right? But if it was now 42, it would work the same way. And then, but of course, the number 42, as you might know, is this kind of like, what's that, the hitchhiker through the universe thing and so on. So he probably had a little bit of that to it, because otherwise everybody would have been fine if the initial Coinbase transaction would have been 100, right? And not 50.
Yeah, that's right. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where the answer to everything is 42.
Yeah, so he didn't want to have that connotation for some. Or you can look up into, he leaves you essentially, if you read my book, I went pretty deep into that. And there's so many options why, like 21, there's certain connotations with them. But of course, there's nothing we can prove, right? That was Satoshi's idea. So that's quite interesting. And then even, I looked that up. Of course, having a pseudonym was very common, right? Like almost all the cypherpunks posted never under their real name, or they posted under their real name and had a couple of pseudonyms to essentially spin a couple of other ideas that they didn't want to see with their name associated and so on. That was quite normal. But very few of them, actually I'm not aware, would just pick a regular name, right? Usually you take something that carries an evident message that you are cool, or that you like maybe reflecting a certain political attitude or cypherpunk attitude, or whatever, like some fun or some pun or something in that. right?
Yep.
Or just have a random thing and then people start thinking, oh yeah, what could that mean? And so on when you read that handle, right? But he just picked a name, and I know all these stories, what that could mean. And it's actually, I have some Japanese friends, so not Satoshi, but actually I have a friend who is Satoshi, but not Nakamoto. And if you ask them, that name doesn't really ring a bell, this kind of centralized intelligence money or so. It is a possible interpretation, but it's far-fetched, right? If you tell
Yeah.
a Japanese person, and I asked a lot of them because I have some friends, and they say, yes, Satoshi Nakamoto, so what? The craziest thing is that's not even so famous in Japan. Right? If you ask the people in Japan, right, you think if you ask Satoshi, who is Satoshi Nakamoto, would be like going to Brazil and asking people who is Pelé, or
Yeah.
to Argentina, who is Diego Maradona, and they would say like, why are you asking? Everybody knows these, but it's just a regular name.
Yeah, but
It
it also seems like Satoshi making this project has definitely he's put some Easter eggs in there, like the title of the newspaper on the first block and so on. But if he's around and still alive and maybe even watching this podcast, hi Satoshi.
Not so
Maybe he's just laughing right now, thinking, I didn't put any Easter eggs
exactly.
into the number 21. I didn't put any Easter eggs into my name, and that's where everybody's looking. Those are
Yeah,
the
probably couldn't stop laughing when he reads my book, how much time I spent on finding all these Easter eggs. And he would just say, look, it was just a spontaneous thing.
yeah,
And I agree. It's likely, as we say, we pretty much have to say with every assumption we have, they're just likely, right? Or
yeah,
plausible,
yeah,
but
yeah,
not definitely provable. And I would say the most likely thing is just what you said, that it was very spontaneous by him. He didn't really put that much brain into making
okay.
these decisions, and he probably enjoys that he has created such a mystery, sometimes even without intention,
Mm,
right? But as you mentioned there, this Times headline, I looked very deeply into that. Evidently that was a reference to the financial markets at the time. But I never really learned. I saw the pre-release version where I couldn't find any. The pre-release was, of course, before January 3rd from the Times, so he couldn't have had it in there. But there was also not a placeholder or anything in the pre-release version. So that seems to have been quite a deliberate, of course, a deliberate because you had to program it into the code, right? But he never really referenced much the financial markets, and he never really had, if it was so important, if you look, I looked at the history of it, right? So he pretty much, I think around that time of beginning of January, the financial markets were at the very rock bottom, or at least around that period,
yeah,
right? That was, but then in spring, for example, 2009, they were crazy going up again, right?
mm,
And so during his lifetime as Satoshi Nakamoto, actually, the financial markets recovered quite substantially. I'm not really sure, but almost recovered totally or even came out higher than they were before. Maybe not exact, but they recovered quite quickly, right? They were on
mm,
a pretty up. He never referred to that, right? He never really
no,
referred to any Dow Jones indices or any like that, or interest rates of the banks or the bailout. That was just punctual, like a single event, and then it was like completely independent what happened in governments about debt crisis and so on. But I would argue, and again, that's only a likely assumption, that he defined himself as Satoshi, not getting involved in politics and so on, because that could also reveal a lot of
yeah,
things about himself. As you
yeah,
mentioned before, was he about wealth and so on? At some stage, from his wording, like if people talk about it, like if you talk about it from the financial, from fintech essentially perspective, if you were enacting a certain persona, you could probably not avoid using some of the jargon that you use with your peers, right?
mm,
Think that everybody knows that, and then only if you see like other people, like your relatives or your grandmother, and talk, you probably don't talk about it or like that,
mm,
but
mm,
that then it comes through. So I think that was his protection. But the Times of London, right? I went to the Times archive and talked to the very friendly employees there, right? And so there was only the print edition of the Times of London where that exact headline in the very wording. And I think it was important to him to have it exactly in that wording, right? It was on the front page. On every other edition, whether the online edition or the international edition, right? That was essentially like on a page 6, or in the online edition, it was not exactly the same headline. It was phrased differently. Usually the online edition evidently doesn't really have a front page or so in that sense, but that was pretty much not on the US edition, right, which was available in the East Coast areas like Washington and New York, I think primarily. It was in Washington and some other East Coast capitals where the news agents would stock it. But I think even that you would. How many Americans do you know that would read the Times of London, right? That is almost an identifier by itself. If you take two attributes, let's say cypherpunk, familiar with cypherpunks and reading the Times of London, you probably have Satoshi Nakamoto, right?
Yeah.
The intersect of these two groups would be very small.
If you take cryptography at the same time, the time period, then we're talking Belgium, because that was a hotspot for cryptography at that time.
Yeah.
But look at the system not from a financial perspective or wealth creation again, and then think about, for instance, I did a kind of academic paper about how Bitcoin kind of rinses itself. It rinses its history because every transaction fee ends up on the table for the miners to grab. But when the miners grab them, it's a newly generated coin. Not many people know this, but you can do it yourself. But just look at how transaction fees follow through the system. That means that they're disconnected from their previous owner's address and then grabbed by the miners, which then looks in the system as newly generated coins, meaning the history of coins or transactions is being wiped over time in transaction fees. This is quite profound because it means it has some kind of function. And I'm questioning, when I saw this, was this a purposely put function of Bitcoin, or is it something that just emerged as a function? I believe stuff like that is emerging functions that I don't know if Satoshi really.
Yeah, I think it's a mixture, right? I just saw an interview on television. It doesn't have to do anything with Bitcoin, right? It was about one of these big time conventional catalog shops, right, that we had in the 80s and 90s or even earlier, right? I think it was essentially after World War II. There were in each country, I think there were these catalogs where you could order from. So essentially an Amazon in print, that you had this catalog that was issued once or twice a year, like IKEA or so, even though IKEA wasn't really home delivery for most of the time. And they said, yeah, actually it failed. Like, for example, they said with Amazon, right? It was a hugely deficitary business in the 1990s because, like, I know one guy who was offered to invest 100 million into Bezos in the 90s, right? He said, I essentially went away from it because at the time, Amazon was just the book selling. And there's no money in book selling. And that was true because he piled up billions of debt in his early business, right? And then as a lot of these unicorns, at some stage, you add that magic potion. Sometimes you could just get lucky, right? Like with your idea, with a certain constellation of the markets, right? And then, so in terms of Bitcoin, I think, and I'm pretty strong on that Satoshi was in a certain way a genius, right? Like but still stuff like you just said, I don't think that all of that was immediately on his agenda, right? He got lucky and he deserved it, that these things worked out, and also that the 21 million worked out, and at some
also
stage
history. I don't think we should underestimate the history that we've been through the last 16 years. I think that history could have taken other turns and we'd get different results to Bitcoin. If we have a starting point of the 3rd of January 2009, and then look at all potential, like a multiverse thinking here, all potential futures from that point, how many futures would include Bitcoin, how many futures would include Bitcoin, and get to the price point or the value that we have today. I don't think there's that many potential futures that has actually played out the way it's played out in our reality. I see so many ways that Bitcoin could have failed if we hadn't gone through pretty much exactly what we've been through. I think it needed the whole Silk Road thing and using Bitcoin for drugs and so on. I think we needed that somehow. We needed to prove a market where there's absolutely no trust between buyer and seller, and here they are using Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I just read a paper the other day from the Norwegian central bank saying why cryptocurrencies and why Bitcoin is not money, because it doesn't fulfill the criteria of money. Yet it is money because it works. So even though it doesn't fill Norwegian central bank's criteria for money, it still works. So they haven't taken that into account. They can say that no, it can't not work. It cannot work because it doesn't fulfill this certain criteria. Yet it works.
Yeah, okay, but these are defense reflexes of traditional businesses, right? Look at the internet, like internet business, right? If you had all the businesses in the 1990s when we already had the internet and the World Wide Web and so on, and all the traditional businesses pushed it off, or it's not so long ago that electric cars were completely dismissed. Just look like 10 years ago, right? When CEOs were laughing at Elon Musk in his Tesla trail there. That's normal, right? If you revolutionize things, you hit the resistance of the businesses that are doing really well without it, right? And they're saying, oh yeah, they're never going to get there. They're going to have these problems and that problems. Yeah, but they can solve them. And sometimes it's like a dynamics that these people are good, that come up with the new ideas. They take risks against evident challenges, and then they find solutions which are unconventional to get around them. So I wouldn't care too much about these skeptics, which are protecting essentially their own business and their own wealth and destroy essentially these new ideas.
No, but it seems to me like when I talk to non-coiners, when I talk to people that haven't experienced coin yet or any cryptocurrency for that matter, they all have very valid reasons why this shouldn't work, why this should fail, why Bitcoin should fall to zero, taking into account the education and the way we've been thinking about money. But it all falls down to it works. It's working fine. It's actually working excellent as a store of value, at least. And some people argue it's you can't use it for purchasing. I can tell you right away, I don't use government currency of any kind. The only time I use government currency is receiving my salary. As soon as I receive my salary, I convert it to Bitcoin. And I have MasterCard connections, Visa connections, which are tied to my Bitcoin wallet. And I travel around the world tapping my phone like everybody else. But I'm not spending from a bank account. I'm spending from my Bitcoin wallet. This myth, I would say, of that it's not a point of purchase, like you have to convert, like you cannot spend your Bitcoin. It's complete bollocks. It's not true. So you do have store of value, you do have medium of exchange, and pricing. That's one of the other factors. I don't believe pricing to be a point of money or a proponent of money, because it doesn't matter for me if it's 20 kroners or $2 or €2 or whatever. I know what I'm spending, and I also use the thought process of how much of 21 million does this thing cost. So if I'm buying, let's say I'm buying something easy. I'm buying milk. I'm buying a gallon of milk, right? How much of 21 million Bitcoins do I have to spend to buy milk? That makes sense inside my brain. And how much of 21 million do I have as a value? How much do I hold of Bitcoin? This in kroners, dollars, pesos, euros, pounds. I have no idea of how much there exists. So I have no relation to the cap. I don't know how much value I have compared to the system. What I do know is some guy over here and some guy over here might have more than me. So they're wealthier than me and can spend more, but I don't have a relation. I don't understand traditional finance and how we accepted that system of
Yeah, that's extremely good point. If people ask, if you tell people, okay, what is the fiat system, right? Let's say from the US perspective, you are printing a number on a sheet of paper and tell other people how much it is worth, right? And you have an endless, essentially, opportunity to control how much you issue. And we know they're issuing, I think there's more dollars issued in the last couple of years than ever were printed in the entire history of the United States, right?
and
And
still we don't
the
know how
crazy,
much
yeah,
that
but the
is.
crazy thing is then if you take the dollar as a lead currency, right? This essentially means that some countries are buying paper bills, right, without wanting anything in exchange for it. They essentially, I mean, at least if you take paper money, I'm not sure whether they all have paper money, but let's say you essentially buy a stack of paper where another country tells you that that is worth that much. Then you lock it away essentially for a lot of storage cost and so on in some vault, right? But you never use it, right? You never
Yeah.
dump all that to buy something from that country. So essentially it's a gift to the United States, right?
Mhm.
It's like you buy paper for selling them a car, but you're
Yeah.
never going to take the paper and want anything from the other country because you need that in your national reserve, right?
Yeah.
And there's so much money in that, like China and Japan and all these countries, they have so many dollars, which are essentially some free credit that is never to be paid back to United
Mhm.
States. And then and the United States can independently of you, so you're not a shareholder, right? Like when you have a stock where you can whatever, chase out the CEO of the company if they don't do the right thing. So you
Yeah.
essentially don't have control of the value because the value is essentially like dependent on how much is going to be printed in the future,
Yeah.
right?
So you have no mathematical control over wealth. While as in Bitcoin, you do have control over how much of the total supply do I have, and can I compare that to a banana or a gallon of milk? Or this notion of the pricing is completely false because pricing is
Yeah,
up
yeah,
to the consumer, not to the monetary system.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah,
there's a lot
let's see.
of
But
political
this
ramifications of that. And
is so interesting because one of the things that's been happening recently is the focus on that stable coins, which is a cryptocurrency, is now taking a bigger role in the world. And I've been thinking about that. We had a big discussion the other day in one of my chat groups about the name stablecoin because it's a coin based on a fiat, right? And what we know from fiat is it falls in value. So stable coin is the complete wrong word to use. It should be falling coin or fiat coin
uh,
because it doesn't hold the value. It's not a store of value. And fiat is not a store of value either. It's failing, it's going down. We know that for sure that,
yeah, if you
in
have an
time,
interest, like the bank interest rate, right? If that's below
yeah,
the inflation rate,
yeah,
essentially fiat is essentially a failure, right? Because you
yeah,
cannot safely save your money. You can just keep the number, but the purchasing power is essentially declining, But the
Yeah.
stablecoin thing is that you have this, like the US government, Trump and so on, propagating them. But the reason is because most stablecoins are in US dollar, right? So you
Yeah.
essentially have to do the same thing. If you want to keep that as a reserve, you have to spend fiat to buy it. So it's essentially taking out dollars that the US government is printing like crazy out of the market and therefore supporting the dollar, right?
Yeah.
That's why I think there's a huge action by the US government to promote them. And I think the whole Trump family is involved in issuing these, or at least in businesses that are related to stablecoin, of course, also Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Talking about these kind of things without value, you want to give us a quick whistle stop tour to your
Sure.
OneCoin experience there?
Yeah, I heard about OneCoin. I was at a seminar in spring of 2016, and I was going to hold a talk about Bitcoin and how the balance of miners, exchanges, users, and node holders all coincide to strengthen the system. And then there was another person at that seminar that didn't get to hold the talk, but was promoting OneCoin. And I was like, oh, what's OneCoin? I hadn't heard about it before then. And she said, it's a Bitcoin killer. And I was like, right away, like, why would you have a cryptocurrency that's trying to kill off Bitcoin? That's the wrong way to go about it. You should embrace Bitcoin and say this is some kind of alternative. So it was very intriguing to me to hear that someone was out to get Bitcoin using Bitcoin technology or the blockchain essentially. And then I had a meeting with this person, and this person showed me the system this was a couple of months later. And the person showed me, I log into this website, onecoin.eu, I think it was. And then I can see my account. I can do transactions from here. And I was like, what happens if the website goes down? And the person was like, I don't have access to my money. But I'm sure it's not going to go down. I'm sure they have redundancies and so on and so forth. I said, anyone can block this, the DDoS attack or something. It's quite easy to block
At that
websites.
stage, they didn't even claim to have a blockchain.
No, they just said we have a blockchain system in the back, and no one's seen it, no one's looked at it, no one knows anything about it, but it's there. We trust that it's there.
But they
And
wouldn't have
all
had
we
an explorer, like a blockchain
Yeah,
explorer or something like that. That was not.
no, they did. They did have some kind of explorer. The first time I saw it, it was very strange because, first of all, it had transaction IDs, it had date stamps, and all of that. It looked very legit. But when I looked at the transactions, there was no transaction, like the user experience did not receive any transaction ID, any date stamp, any measurable thing. The only thing they could see was I'm moving this amount from me to another person, which made me go down a wrong rabbit hole at first, which was how do you do multi transactions from many to one or from one to many? And that wasn't possible. It was just one to one. So that was okay. How are you going to kill off Bitcoin when you don't even have that kind of functionality? But I ignored it at that point. But then I was contacted through LinkedIn by a recruitment company in Japan.
In Japan, even.
And yeah, and they were quite serious. They had been in contact with a cryptocurrency company out of Bulgaria, and they were recruiting for this company, and they had found my LinkedIn profile. Seemed also that they had done some preliminary research on me. And as I was holding talks about Bitcoin and so on, I didn't find it very strange that they were reaching out to me. And they asked me a bunch of questions about my job history and what I've been doing and what do I know about cryptocurrencies and so on and so forth. And we ended the job interview. This was on the 29th of September, the 28th or 29th of September. And we ended the job interview with, he said he would come back to me next week and that I was a very hot candidate for this job which was a C-level position, and it was more described to me as a global chief technology officer, so global CTO. And I just didn't think much about it.
We're talking about
And
2016, right? Or
2016,
yeah,
yes.
okay.
And then I got an email a couple of days later saying he wanted to have a new meeting with me on the 5th of October. And we had the new meeting, but this time it was different. He was being quite pushy on, okay, this is the deal. We want you for this job. We can offer you an apartment in London, an apartment in Bulgaria, cars in both London and Bulgaria, and you could probably get a car in Norway too when you're off on vacation. And then like a Mercedes or BMW class car in all those locations, and a salary of £250,000. And I was like, whoa, that's a good salary. I haven't seen any cryptocurrency jobs out there where they've been floating that kind of salary and those kind of offers. And I said, I would need to know which company this is for. And he's, let's hold off on that a little. I said, okay, what will I be doing for this company? And he's, as far as I know, the systems that they're running right now isn't compatible, and we need you to build them a blockchain. And that kind of took me back a little, and I was like, compatible? What do you mean compatible? And he was talking about some database, but it was obvious from the phone call that he himself, he was a recruiter. He wasn't a technical person, but it sounded to me like, are they running like an SQL or Oracle database or something like that, and then just doing it somehow, and they need the blockchain system. And quickly thinking to myself, this is an easy fix. We need to shut the whole thing down. We need to fork the Bitcoin blockchain. We need to do the adjustments. And then we need to like give everybody their money back by doing transactions off the Coinbase. We could do pre-mined tokens of whatever tokens are out there already, and then start it back up, estimating that this could be done in a 2-week, 3-week span where we basically shut down the system for 3 weeks. I didn't share my thoughts, but I said, I'm interested, but what company is this for? And then he said, I'll tell you, it's OneCoin. Have you heard of them before? And I was like, yeah, I've heard of them. And thinking back to the meetings that I'd had earlier, the person that I'd met earlier about the website and onecoin.eu, and I was like, a blockchain isn't going to fix everything here. We need to decentralize this, and we can't run a private blockchain. It doesn't work like that. But of course, the recruiter had no idea what I was talking about. But I said I would get back to him. I believe this was a Thursday or a Friday, and I said I would get back to him over the weekend. And during that weekend, I talked to some friends, and they were like, dude, this sounds very dodgy. You shouldn't accept this job. And I don't know, I don't want to sound racist or anything like that, but I do have a greater respect for countries like Switzerland and UK and Sweden and Norway and Scandinavian countries than I do to Bulgaria. It's just something there that makes me have more confidence in those countries that I mentioned than I have confidence in Bulgaria. So I was taken back, and then I contacted him that Monday saying that I wouldn't take the job. And that was it for me. I was done at that point. I was just like, all right, let's continue on looking for jobs and see if anything pops up. And I didn't think about it much at all and put it aside until mid-November, where a video popped up I think someone sent it to me. I believe it was the same guy that I'd spoken to that weekend where we were contemplating the job. But he sent me a video where Ruja was on stage. It was from Bangkok and it was filmed on the 1st of October. So it was filmed right in between my two job interviews. And Ruja Ignatova was on stage in Bangkok in front of what looked like close to 10,000 people. And she is promoting and starting the new blockchain system. And I was like, how come she's starting a new blockchain? And then 5 days later, I'm having a meeting with a guy that says, I need to build him a new blockchain. And I looked over the video several times, and I can tell that from her, when she's standing on stage discussing, this is supposed to be a very happy moment for that company, a happy situation, and she should be ecstatic and full of good energy. But she's standing on stage and she is closed off. Her shoulders are like up to her ears, and she's deathly afraid of what words are leaving her mouth. She is definitely not comfortable on that stage compared to other videos that I've seen on her on stage. And so I draw the conclusion that she has to be lying. She has to be lying. And why would they ask me to build them a blockchain on the 5th of October when they already start a new blockchain on the 1st of October?
Yeah, but you heard about this fake it until you make it, right?
Yeah. But
So
they
yeah, I know
did
here
it on
it's
stage. They
yeah,
did it
yeah.
and doubled everybody's coins, and that was crazy. And they also increased the coin supply and stuff like this. And that's just, it was weird. So I decided at that point, I want to dig into this. I want to figure out. So I have some friends from, I guess, in lack of a better organization or what to mention, I guess they're hackers that worked on taking down the Church of Scientology, definitely associated with the hacker group Anonymous. And I asked them if there was any way I could gain access to any accounts to access the website, start looking into that blockchain system that they had, and so on and so forth. And within half an hour, I had 60 accounts. So that was quite easy. And I started looking at it, and the only identifier that I could find out from the transactions and how you did transactions was if I do a special number, like doing 1.111111 and sending it to another account, then going in the back office and looking at what they call the blockchain, and then finding my transaction there. And so I did this over and over again, and I couldn't find a single transaction because I didn't have, even though there was transaction IDs in the back office or blockchain system, there was no transaction ID or timestamp or anything that I could identify with the transactions except for the transaction amount. And I took into account that there might be some transaction fees or anything, but it didn't make sense because if I sent 1.1112 from one account to another account, I would get the exact amount into the other account. So there was no transaction fee being deducted from that transaction. And that's where it started. I went public with this in the end of February in 2017. And I got in touch with some people. There's a guy called Tim Curry in California that's been watching OneCoin over the years. And he had been in touch with the German police. And he asked me if I would be willing to talk to the German police. And that ended up with me going to Germany, to Düsseldorf, and having an interrogation with the German police already in the beginning of March of 2017. And basically from there on, it was crazy. We were up all night and we were doing victim support, and got in touch with Jennifer McAdam. She had contacted the English or the London City Fraud Squad, which is basically the financial police in the UK. And I had several meetings with them, and then the Hungarian police contacted me, the Hong Kong police contacted me, and the ball just started rolling.
Yeah, and the Rujar kind of has disappeared around that time, has never been found until today,
Yeah,
right?
she disappeared in the fall in September of 2017. So there was quite a long period, several months, where she was still running the company and we could still access her. But she even went online and made videos about someone out there is claiming that he's got a job at OneCoin and didn't take it. And someone is claiming that we don't have a blockchain, but we definitely do. But I was drawing conclusions that this had to be a database of some kind. It had to be because there was several functions in OneCoin that I've never seen in other cryptocurrencies. For instance, doubling your coins or using mining tokens to mine OneCoin. A lot of stuff that didn't make sense in a cryptocurrency world.
But what was there, like coming back a little bit to Bitcoin? In Bitcoin, I think one strength is its simplicity. Even if you don't know anything about, if you just consider, okay, blockchain and this peer-to-peer, let's say if you talk to a non-technical person, you can say, okay, that's a bulletproof kind of assurance that your money is safe
Yep.
if you put it on a very simple terms, right? And then you say, and there is a mathematical limit of total coin issuance or total supply, like this 21 million, right? And if a non-technical person talks to a technical person like yourself that you can trust, right? Then it's a very simple thing. Essentially, you can say, okay, just imagine it's gold on a digital scale, and there's only so much gold you can mine on this planet, and most of that, from a nowadays perspective, is already mined, right? It's approaching, it's somewhere close to 20 million, I think 19.6 or something, and just 1 million or 1.5 million, something in that range to go, right? That is some very simple message of how the thing would create value in a world of fiat where endless printing of money is available. That is, in my terms, maybe there's a smarter way, but I think that if somebody's concerned about inflation, the value of money, and tells you, look, I wanted to buy gold, but for that I would need to go to the bank, I have to buy VAT in a lot of countries and have a safe place, and if I want to go somewhere else, taking a lot of gold with you across an airport and so it's probably quite difficult. And that would be in simple terms, okay, what do you get when you buy Bitcoin or maybe even other cryptocurrencies? But what was the OneCoin story in terms of how it creates value? I never really get that. Just because you can do transactions, right? What is, I can order at Amazon. If there's no blockchain or so, I have the same thing. I get a certain good for it. And so what was their value creation? What was the reason why people invested so much money out of wish that how could a real value arise from that? I really got.
The only thing that I could take out of that was that this was going to kill off Bitcoin. So whatever Bitcoin was doing, this was better. They convinced their investors of that. And then, but they were at certain seminars and so on, they were showing transactions, but they were showing Bitcoin transactions and saying that this is how OneCoin will work very soon. And then, but we're showing you on Bitcoin. They also said they use the pizza story of Bitcoin a lot. That yeah, it's worth OneCoins are not worth a lot today, but just look at what happened to Bitcoin, and also that it's it's not market driven, but centrally priced. And this was just like, what? What do you mean centrally priced? Yeah. No, the company, or essentially Ruja Ignatova, was the one setting the price of what a OneCoin should be worth. So when you look at, there's a famous quote from the Bernie Madoff scam that the graph never went down, it just went up. There was no, it never had a dip. And the same thing was in OneCoin. It would just, it would climb up like a staircase.
So people could get payouts or what? So if I really gave them my
Yeah.
money, there
Oh
was a
yeah.
certain chance I gave them a grant and I got 1.5 grand back at some stage. And that would
Yeah.
work to a certain extent, right? That they just
But
get enough new customers to even support that.
yep.
Just if all customers had come and wanted to cash out. Okay, but that's also not possible
But
in the.
but also it was limited because of the way they were selling it. They were using the multi-level marketing. It was passed down through the pyramid scheme here, down to sellers that would sell it initially on the street or to individuals, where everybody up the ladder would get like 10%, 5%. The main value would go out to Rouge on top. But it's multi-level marketing. How do you get your money back out? You initially had to go to your upline, right? So whoever sold you the coins is the one that can get your cash back. And there it ran into problems fast where people like Jennifer McAdam has a story where her refrigerator failed and she needed to buy a new refrigerator. Now she didn't want to sell her OneCoin, but she didn't have a choice. She needs a refrigerator. So she contacted her upline and tried to sell off some of her OneCoin, where the upline said, "Why would you want to sell right now? It's going to go up in price in a couple of days. Just hold on." And she's, "In a couple of days, all my food is going to be rotten. I need a fridge today." And that's where this kind of all failed, is the people at the bottom that wanted to get some of their profits out, or they couldn't after a certain point. You had to be on the inside. You had to build quite a large network of people around you, like a downline, before you could really benefit and get some money out of the system.
Yeah, but have you sometimes, I just asked this question, right? Did you ever come across a knowledgeable person, let's say that would be on par with yourself, who would have invested in this? Like somebody who really knows what things about money, things about blockchain, and question really openly, why is this thing increasing in price? So not like a belief system that we had this discussion initially on Bitcoin
Yeah,
and why there's a good chance that it will rise, right?
yeah.
But of course, also it will have falls, and like every Bitcoiner knows it, that it's not always going to rise. But did you ever come across people who really knew what they were talking about? Even, I'm not sure how far you got up there. I guess you didn't talk about to Ruja, and because you were not part of it, right? You were just in the
Mm.
recruitment there. But was there anybody who could ever seriously explain it to you with like hard financial arguments? Why that was a Bitcoin killer, why that would have any value increase and so on?
Unfortunately, I don't think that anyone that has a reasonable understanding of, let's say, Austrian School of Economics, supply and demand, would buy OneCoin. And that is, it's a simple fact. And I remember my dad was quite a good investor. He started some businesses, and I was curious because he was talking about stocks throughout my childhood. And I would ask him when I went to bed as a child, what are stocks? How much do they cost? Where do I get them? And he told me one thing over and over again is nothing is worth more than what someone else is willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
That's the price. That's the price. There's no exception to that rule. Oil is free. You just gotta dive down in the Norwegian Sea and pick it up yourself.
That applies to
Go.
Norway, not to Ireland.
Gold is free. You just gotta find a stream and start digging out the gold.
Yeah.
Everything is free. What you're paying for is work. And what all money, there's no money going to gold. There's no money going to Bitcoin. There's no money going to a car itself. It's going to the people who did the work. there is no, up until this point in history, the only entities that can get money is companies and individuals. Nothing else can get money. There is no, a dog cannot get a money.
Yeah, but there's an intrinsic value, right? That's
Yeah.
what often is held against Bitcoin, right? If I have a farm, I might suffer from prices up and down, and I might have a good year and a bad year, but supposedly that everybody wants whatever crop, right? There's always going to be
But
a finite
intrinsic,
price of crop.
yeah,
And
intrinsic value doesn't even work on a scale of time because that crop is going to get rotten. A banana has intrinsic value because you can eat it, but at some point that banana becomes rotten. Gold doesn't have intrinsic value. We say it does, but it goes into electronics, and that's why it has intrinsic value. What do we know about electronics? They only last for 4, 5, 6, 7
Yeah.
years, and then they're old tech. So it gets
Yeah, but
intrinsic value is always based off of time.
okay, but there is sustainable stuff where it's reasonable to assume that a company that is whatever highly innovative and so on, and you trust the management and the business model, then it will have always more than a zero value. And I would just, but then you have, let's say, on blockchain, even like these meme coins, where yes, this applies, right? They do have a value. So if I'm smart sensing that something goes up, and I just know the point in time where the hype is peaking and I sell it, it's also having a value, but a long-term thing, right? Where
But do companies, seriously, let's think about this for a second. Do companies always have value?
not always, but
I
often.
mean, yeah, but let's look at the most successful companies over time. Maybe not money, but over time. What do we have? The ones that come to mind is like Coca-Cola. They've been
Yeah.
around for a long time, right? But they're still around. They're still doing business. They're hugely successful. And yeah, but will they forever be here? I don't think
A reasonable time
for
until
a
everybody.
reasonable time. Yeah, exactly. What about a house? You buy a house, you have to invest in that house. If it's a good brick and mortar house, then it can last for 500,000 years. But still,
Yeah, but with a house, it's
it doesn't
mostly
exist for forever.
for a high value house, you pay more for essentially the land than the house itself, right? The replacement of the house, if you have the land,
So okay,
would still
so
cost money, but yeah.
we agree that land maybe is one of those things that stick around for forever.
No, not even that. If you look at communist countries, like I'm originally from Germany, right? In East Germany, they disowned people for, let's say, the good of the community, right? In socialism, right? Companies were disowned and transferred to state, and then they went down the slide. But yeah, we talk about humanly, you cannot really talk about whatever eternity, right? But for human scales that matter to a typical human life, you have certain pseudo stabilities that have, in
that
most
corresponds
cases,
with lifetime, right? It
yeah,
corresponds with lifetime. What is going to be valuable in most of my lifetime? And I see that, but I also see the risk factors that are there. I like talking about property because property, yeah, it's a place, it's land, it's you can build a house on it, but I don't know when the viewers of this video are watching this video, but right now I don't think property is worth much in Tel Aviv or in Tehran in Iran. You're not going to be able to sell anything there right now. So the prices, the store of value of land is simply not there because of geopolitical, like you said, Eastern Germany, where they took the land away from you, or wars or anything like that. But let's look at something that's even older, like gold, right? Gold is a value bearer, a store of value that has been around for centuries now, at least 1,000 years.
or more than that. It was
Yeah,
even in ancient cultures. Yeah.
but gold is also based on technology, and here's why. Because we're getting better and better for every year that passes. in finding gold, in digging out gold, using new technologies, new shovels, new everything to find more gold. Now, you said that there's a limited amount of gold in the world and we've found about half. I don't think so. I think there's much more gold than that. Because if you look at it, gold has doubled in supply for every 33 years. And that's just because in 33 years, we've been more than doubling our capabilities technologically to
Yeah, but you
extract
also,
gold.
if you talk about shovels, they're quite sophisticated, expensive shovels and energy and so on. It's like that parallel to Bitcoin mining is in
Yeah.
terms of how much energy it takes and therefore also money to find new stuff is increasing all the time. And as long as the value of gold rises reasonably, then that's, yeah. But you could also say about space exploration, if your one day technology able to whatever harvest gold from a comet or something like that swirling around the planet, we might have suddenly a massive supply.
We might find that one day. It might be very possible for us to do that. I don't know what the world is going to look like in 33 years from now, but it seems plausible that might be something that they can do in 33 years or 66 years.
Yeah.
Then we come back to Bitcoin. How do we shut it down? We don't. It's impossible to shut down Bitcoin. How does Bitcoin fare in wars? Yeah, locally, it might be hard to mine and source electricity and so on, but there's never been a war that we know of and potentially can happen that is globally spanning at any given time, meaning it's always going on everywhere at the same time.
Yeah, okay, but even
So
if that happened, you have other problems than saving your money,
yeah,
right?
so the whole value proposition goes out the window if that would happen. But other than that happening, you can't shut down the internet. You can shut it down for certain areas, but Bitcoin doesn't need the internet. You can run Bitcoin on, I've run Bitcoin on SMS technology. I've run Bitcoin on even radio technology, FM radio technology. It's just numbers. It's just numbers that need to come across a medium. It doesn't need the internet. It ultimately needs the internet to get recorded into a block, but it doesn't need the internet for a one-time or two-time sending of a transaction. You can do that on paper. You can just basically have, say, half a Bitcoin on a wallet, print out that private key and hand that private key over to someone else on a piece of paper. That's a transaction right there.
Yeah.
What am I saying here? I'm saying that Bitcoin has the potential to live on for thousands of years without losing its value. And also, it is limited to 21 million. No matter what we do, that's never going to change. And that has, gold doesn't have it, property doesn't have it, nothing else that we've experienced throughout human history has those properties.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. Like just to also come to an end here, I usually ask my interviewees like some questions there. Coming back to the very origins, like with Satoshi Nakamoto, right? There's a lot of speculation what he did before and in particular during his lifetime as Satoshi Nakamoto. What do you think is he doing now? Of course, supposing that he's still alive, which I say it's extremely likely. It's all likeliness, but I don't think it's one of these people like Finney or so who has passed away. I have like first-hand accounts from some of his closest friends who asked him actually personally, not on podcasters, almost on his deathbed, whether he was Satoshi, and he denied in some form or another. And you can always say, yeah, okay, but maybe that was his sacred thing there that he wanted to, whatever, take into his deep freezing, you know. But anyway, so I'd say like most likely he's still alive. So what do you do after Bitcoin? You have created that ingenious thing, and I think he must have known how great this is, right? He planned he didn't suddenly disappear, right? He didn't get into a car accident or so. That was a well-crafted exit where he said, I need to disappear for the sake of Bitcoin, right? So my identity is protected also for the sake of Bitcoin, maybe also for his private. He didn't want to disturb something like that. But it was definitely also good for Bitcoin. I think you even mentioned that in the very beginning, right? But then what you do next, right? You cannot really come with your CV and say, look, I'm Satoshi here. Can I apply for a C-level like this? Similar, like they could have offered him the OneCoin position, right? That they offered to you. But seriously, think of him as a human, not as an artificial figure, right? That is the peak of your career. You essentially create one of the most valuable enterprises, even though it's not an enterprise, but like the value, like it's incredible. It's past $1 trillion nowadays. Of course, he didn't know, as you said before, that was probably not on his mind. That was like a fantasy maybe, but not reality. But you created this and it's going up and down, but usually more up after a while than it has gone down in the interim, you know. And then you hit the floor, and then what? You completely distance yourself from that thing. You don't have opinions on it. You wouldn't, whatever, want to interfere with Taproot, with SegWit, and the block size wars and all that going on. When you're thinking, wow, I'm sitting here, I created that thing, I know exactly what they should do, but I'm not going to talk. Or are you going to create another persona or reappear with your real name, just not saying that you're Satoshi Nakamoto and work at Blockstream or something like that? I think that's from a psychological human perspective. It's really, what are you going to do? Let's say an athlete, right, who is whatever, like Usain Bolt or some guy like that. You're always wondering, you're the world class, right? You get all this fame. Yeah, okay, these guys then get their adverts, they do commercials and have public speaking, but always with the history of their past success. Without that, all these ex-footballers and so on, like David Beckham, he wouldn't be able to run all his businesses without the fame and maybe even the money he collected, but mostly the fame, right, as the ex-world star player at Real Madrid or so on. So I always wonder, what is he doing? He has that brilliant mind that is probably capable of doing 1,000 other things, right? And then you completely detach yourself. And so what's your angle at that?
First, let me say that from the time perspective of the viewer of this podcast, Satoshi Nakamoto is right now watching this podcast. And then we have to look at not who is Satoshi, but what is Satoshi.
Exactly.
And Satoshi is all of us, except two people. It's not Dorian Nakamoto, and it's not Craig Stephen Wright. So those are the only two people that we can totally exclude from this. But other than that, I think Satoshi lives in all of us. We all have this stroke of genius and the potential to do something great. And I think based on how genius Bitcoin is and what it takes of brain power to come up with something like that, you must also realize that you've done it, you've solved it, you've fixed something, and therefore you don't need to do anything more.
But look, I think he was about 30 years old. And I talked to guys who made millions, self-made millions in their 20s, also on, probably from a similar background as you. And they said, then I retired and thought I just go to Vegas and have my boat and so on. And they said, I did that for 3 months. And then I wanted to use my brain again. Then I couldn't stay away from my laptop and making great ideas happen and so on. So I cannot see that he retired. Sure. You cannot retire the genius in you. It's almost like a threat, like a constant driver, right? That makes you want to do things that you have on your mind. And I don't think you can retire that. And I think he would certainly be able, let's say, you mentioned the offer and then the order of magnitude that you could have made on that CTO job or so. I think for him, he would definitely have the technical capabilities to have a multi-$100,000 a year job, right? With all the benefits in Silicon Valley or so.
Why? It can't be money driven. I'm pretty sure that Satoshi, at some point early in the game, took some money from some regular work and bought some Bitcoin for himself. And if he did that, say in 2010, 2011, he bought it on an exchange. He didn't want to associate himself with his wallets, but he still got a, excuse the expression, but he still got a shitload of Bitcoin. He probably bought,
Yeah,
you know,
you think Satoshi
100
Nakamoto
Bitcoin.
went to whatever Coinbase and so on and bought Bitcoin?
Maybe to hide his identity. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. He went to Mt. Gox and
Oh,
or
Mt. Gox, yeah.
BitInstant or any of those and bought a little to make it disassociate himself. But buying a little in 2010 is still 100, 150, 200 Bitcoin.
Yeah, okay,
Which
but
is
still.
today's value is, we're talking 20 million. Why would you even spending those Bitcoins up through that age, and say you spend half every year, you still have enough to live a lifetime
Yeah,
without any problem.
but from my experience, and again, it's all about likeliness, right? I'm in academia and I've been around a couple of extremely intelligent people, right? Who not necessarily are, I think there some of them are maybe multi-millionaires, but not like Elon Musk or something like that. You know, say they have a few million somewhere in real estate and whatever, in gold, maybe in Bitcoin or something like that. So technically you could retire, right? You could say, okay, you can whatever, get like 5, 6, 7% a year. That would give you a few 100,000, let's say every year. So you can certainly don't have to go to the soup kitchen, right?
Yeah,
But
if
they
you're
still
talking,
don't,
yeah,
right? They want to
yeah,
play their role, right? They
yeah,
assume whatever. Sometimes I find crazy positions in some organizations that I don't really understand what they're doing, but they want to get the recognition from others, right? They like not only status symbols like a Ferrari in your driveway or so, but they want to go to a place where they have a high ranking position that they can instruct others, that they have a few people working for them, and at least perceiving that they have a certain influence. They just don't want to sit at home, even if that was financially possible, and just spend their money and have a good life, at least not at 30 years old. There might be some people like that, but it's actually more often that they try to find a purpose beyond just being rich, especially like a Satoshi
well,
who
yeah.
yeah.
I think definitely it makes sense that Satoshi is still using his brain for something. What is he working on then? I think it would definitely be something to do with energy, figuring out how to do energy, maybe what is it, fission or fusion, or I'm
Hmm.
not an energy guy myself, but there's different conundrums and unsolved things in that realm that definitely needs
Yeah, but the problem there is, right? Oh, look at Bitcoin, right? That was
mm,
pretty much the only thing that could come literally out of nothing. Or, okay, there were these precursors or so where you could essentially sit at home. You didn't have to apply for a job. He apparently didn't apply seed funding, going to
mm,
VCs, business angels, and so on. That was
mhm,
the only thing, let's say, if you're just smart and self-teach your on even the cryptography, right? Even though I think it's a genius, like all the cryptographers tell me, okay, the cryptography itself in Bitcoin is quite simple, right? It was like 20,
mm,
30 years old, even at the time, and essentially an advanced hobbyist with a self-drive to autodidactically essentially teach yourself, you could have come up with that. But there's not that many. If you say infusion, right? If you apply now as a whatever, the crypto guy to a fusion like center in whatever the new Ether or in UK or so in these
yeah.
facilities, right? And you still need a CV. Right? You cannot say I was Satoshi Nakamoto, now give me the CEO job of your facility, right? You always need a track record in these businesses.
Uh,
And in Fusion, you cannot really do anything on your own because it's such a big investment that it's
no, for
essentially
sure. Is he working for CERN or something like that? Maybe how he got there. I don't know. He might have flashed his genius in some way, come up with the right questions or the right answers to certain things, and not even having a bachelor's degree, you could end up at CERN.
Yeah, but
I
there
don't,
are
I
already
don't,
there are already many geniuses at CERN. I actually know some
yeah,
people. I actually once had a job offer at CERN, but not because I'm a
yeah.
super genius. That was more like a. But I know a lot of people who went to CERN. Yeah, these are
Mm,
super intelligent people that we just don't see in the public because they might not be influencers, or they do stuff that is not so easy to explain or interesting to the general public.
yep.
So I think like the geniuses I've seen, you have already a couple of them at CERN, but with a specific, often decade-long track record in the topics that they do. So if you're just applying as a genius, you would have to start, if you get a job at all, you have to start pretty low down the ladder. And then you have a lot of other people telling you what to do. And I'd say if you have such a self-drive as Satoshi Nakamoto, you don't want to be really like taken very closely controlled and micromanaged or something like that, and jolt yourself or work yourself all the way up until whatever you're 60, and then you have something to say, right? That's
Mm.
one character trait. So I don't think I heard a lot of, not a lot of, that's
Well,
exaggerated, but I had some very competent people who actually knew almost everybody in the scene. And they started their companies also based on not cryptocurrency necessarily, some of them did, but on crypto technology. So some of
mm,
them were like the ones who did the cryptography for WhatsApp and the Apple stuff and so on, and sold it to Apple. And they told me, some of them, you always have this, some say this, some say that. I just want to be honest, right? But I found this idea very, very cool. They said, look, there's some companies, and they mentioned the names, who got, based on stuff that was related to cryptography, sometimes even Bitcoin, right? They got so much money in, let's say, in a first round funding, and you're from the business world, right? You know that for first round funding or even seed funding, that's more like in a few $100,000 or single million regime, right? If you don't have a running business or have proven that your money, your company can generate significant revenues, at least that you have a serious potential for that, right? And not just a PowerPoint presentation. For that, you rarely get a lot of money, right? And there's some companies in that field who got hundreds of millions at very early stage, right?
yeah.
For example, and they said, look, I funded companies in the crypto space. They were successful. I sold them and so on. But that amount of money, and then they pointed me to people that say, look, Satoshi Nakamoto could have just shown his assets, right? And says, look, take that as a backing for these huge amounts of money that I want to have from you at very early stage. And these would have to sign confidentiality agreements and all that, and probably wouldn't have a self-interest in revealing him, because that would essentially then erode the value of their money, or at least there would be some danger that would happen.
But
So I would say,
let's toy with the idea that Satoshi Nakamoto got caught, and
you mean
he's
by the agencies or?
by the agencies,
Yeah.
that they somehow figured out who it was and got caught. What would happen if that happened? First of all, they wouldn't mention that in the news, and they would for sure not put a person like that in jail. They would put him to work at the NSA or FBI, or and have him.
Even keep him as an asset, because sometimes you
Yep,
just want to have the potential, right?
yep,
Let's say the US government was afraid that Bitcoin would replace the US dollar as a global de facto standard currency. And in these agencies, that's also what I learned from them, they do have these long-term visions, right? They can afford to spend crazy money on, let's say, finding Satoshi just for the purpose that they have a tool at hand that they don't want to play in the near
mm.
future, but just to have a little bit of a threat, right? Yeah, that
It's
could be
it's
the case, that they actually
it's
know who
either that
Satoshi.
or he jumped back on his time machine and went back to the future.
Yeah, but the one thing I asked some of these people, right, whether it would have been possible for the NSA, for example, that they all the communication on file and would even have like geolocation data attached to IP addresses and so on, even with Tor and so on. There's some options that they can track it down. But I was told, okay, that is possible, but even for the NSA, with their mind-blowing capabilities, they would have to have you on a target list to really track you down, let's say, crack Tor and its hiding of locations and so on and identities. They would need to really have you on the list. And they told me, look, maybe Satoshi's departure was that it's, for example, my favorite candidate, he was pretty close with Tor, the Tor project, right? So he certainly knew that once you get on the target list, then they will find you, right? So I think that he realized, okay, I can only be a Satoshi Nakamoto as long as that is a minor project that is not on the watch list of these agencies, and I have to disappear well in time before I get there, because then they're going to definitely find me. And I thought, so because it was very surprising how he actually disappeared. He seems to have that, I think from the outset, he knew that he would have to disappear at some stage. So I think it was like, okay, when he thought, okay, pretty much everything that I could do is done. Now I have a sufficiently large community who will be able to fix the bugs. There were a couple of bugs and so on that he still fixed, right? But then he had a vision, okay, everything that I'm not really needed anymore. So I go into that peer-to-peer kind of thing where I don't want to be the prominent figure. I do that for my own protection, right? So I cannot be found because I personally just don't want to be known as Satoshi Nakamoto and the wealthy guy and all that, also the negative consequences of that. And also for the protection of the network itself. That's my hypothesis, that he just left too early, and that was, I think, not coincidental. I think it was well planned that he knew, okay, I have to disappear essentially after a while, so otherwise they will find me, and that will not be good for Bitcoin, and that might have destroyed Bitcoin. Let's say if they had found him in 2009, right?
Yep.
He owned, I think, 90%, like a huge chunk, the vast majority of the Bitcoin in 2009, which is a lot because, like, at that time, you were getting 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. And he was essentially the only miner, at least in the majority of 2009. And then he even scaled back, right? I've seen these statistics. I'm not sure whether you read these papers. He seemed to have volunteered to reduce his hash power as others were jumping on. At least there's some good study.
There wasn't a difficulty change on the blockchain before December 23rd, I believe it was the first difficulty change on the blockchain, which means basically that there was only one computer from the 3rd of January all the way until the 23rd of December that was mining Bitcoin.
Yeah, at least chiefly, right? I think Halfini and so on. I think like some people had some short, let's say, stints at mining, but then whatever, Halfini, I think, said like at some stage the fan of my computer was annoying me too much, so I switched off.
No, it's crazy. I don't have an answer, but it's always going to be there as a question. I don't know if we'll ever be able to answer it, but I'm thinking also, do you think that Satoshi, from his standpoint, sees Bitcoin as a successful experiment yet?
Not in the sense of the white paper, it failed, right? Because he didn't want to. Actually, that's when we talked about this wealth development, right? I don't think that was his primary thing. I think he'd rather had seen it as a replacement for PayPal or credit card systems. We go to a store. If you go to Asia, like I've been recently to Asia, to Vietnam or so, and they essentially pay a lot of things with what's that called, this WeChat. right?
Yep.
That doesn't have to do anything with blockchain, but they essentially do something that would be similar to what you would do if Bitcoin was this everyday thing that you pay with. They essentially have a 2D barcode that they show on their phone, and the recipient, so the taxi driver receives it, and that essentially, that's more what he would have expected, right? Or foreseen. It's a peer-to-peer payment system, not a peer-to-peer wealth creation system. So he really thought, and if you talk to these people who had Bitcoin in 2009, 2010, right, they spend it all, right? Like they were not what we call hodling nowadays. They would just go and have fun, whatever. Like they thought, okay, that's cool money, that's in our spirit, so let's go to Starbucks and buy a coffee for it.
You gotta give them credit, because there was a 99.999% chance that this is not going to work.
Yeah,
So
that's what they all thought.
Let's spend it while
As long as it's worth
working.
something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but this peer-to-peer thing is, if you read the white paper and his initial messages, I think that was his emphasis, right? That we should, instead of paying with dollars, we buy our everyday stuff with Bitcoin on a broad scale.
But looking at Bitcoin today, do you think Satoshi is happy with what an achievement it's been, and is he satisfied? Is this the level of Bitcoin that he was envisioning?
If you talk to psychologists,
or
right?
is he dissatisfied because it's not what he thought it was going to be?
Yeah, and then maybe started another blockchain that would be closer to that. But psychologically, and maybe if you reflect it to yourself, we all a different person than 15 years ago, right? 15 years ago, psychologically, it's often read that. I'm not a psychologist myself, but essentially, if you were talking to a psychologist 15 years ago and he would profile you on that, it's quite likely that if he didn't see you and see your passport and like anonymously, let's say, just have a chat with let's say a non-video chat, like an audio chat with you, and he was analyze you, what kind of person are you 15 years ago, and then carry out the same interview this time, there's quite a chance, if you don't have any physical means like voice or vision or so, to not be able to assign you to the same person that he interviewed 15 years ago. Satoshi, he's just a human being. Right? He's not as we like to make him very mysterious, like almost a religious, like founding figure or so, but he's still a human, right? So you adjust over time. You get cool about certain things that you might have been very passionate about in your younger days. You might have whatever. You might accept realities, but so I'm not so sure whether he is. I don't think he was any fanatic. Or even if you look at I've been to the Bitcoin 25 conference just a few weeks ago. What you see there is quite astonishing. Like essentially, except there was Adam Back because his business interest. He had a big booth there with Blockstream, and I even saw him. And Marty Malmy was there. And with all respect to Marty, but he's a person who, like, he was on stage and he cannot really talk. And that doesn't mean I think bad of him, but he's not really like a sensational speaker and entertainer. But he was mostly about other things. He was not that Bitcoin evangelist or anything like playing that role. But there's none of these heroes of the 90s and 2000s. None of them was even speaking there. So where are they all? So Satoshi might have also advanced. All this cypherpunk movement essentially doesn't really exist anymore in the sense that it was in the 90s and 2000s, or these people have gone all into different directions. Some of them have.
You're thinking about like Charlie Shrem and Eric Voorhees, and they're still around. And why aren't they at the conferences? Maybe they're...
in the scene, these big evangelists of Bitcoin in the past and nowadays, some of these guys have their own cryptocurrencies, but very few of them are essentially still involved. If you look at influencers, right, who is having the most followers on various platforms and so on, they don't, some of them are still around, but some of them have completely switched off they don't want to hear about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies anymore. They say they're into more exciting stuff and whatever. But so in that sense, Satoshi might have also morphed into a different person. Just as we all develop, we have all different life experience. He might have a family and some issues with health or not, or another passion, whatever, he started golfing or so. Yeah, of course, I don't know, but it's likely that it's not so important for him from a, like sometimes your passions from your younger days peter out a little bit and you get anchored in the realities, whether your kids get a good education at school or whether your political party is doing well or whatever. You often see that. So I'm pretty sure he's not the Satoshi with his spirit when he started his journey on Bitcoin, probably in 2006, 2007 or so. That's what I think.
But you're from a psychological point of view again. You do have these kind of flames in your life where you're really engaged in something. And I guess if that flame burns at a very hot intensity for a very long time, maybe you're just tired.
Or you're looking for something else. I've seen that very often, that in research, the best researchers, they sometimes get bored with their own invention. Right? Yeah. After you've given 20 talks on this thing and people only want to hear that, and some of them that just say, look, guys, I got invited for this talk, but actually I'm already doing this exciting stuff, they say at the end of their plenary talk and so on. But nobody wants to hear that. Everybody just wants to hear. I think that's also with Malmi, right? Just think like you were always asked about stuff you did 15 years ago, right? And that was the young Bjørn, right?
Yeah.
That's okay. I think we have spent a lot of time now, and I thank you so much for being available. I really enjoyed it, and hopefully the listeners will get some insights and get something out of this. But thanks so much for sharing your story with us, and for me at least, I enjoyed it very much, and thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Bye-bye.